My name's Melanie Lenz. I work as a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I'm delighted to be here as a judge for the Ashurst Emerging Art Prize. So my pathway into the arts, I started by studying history at university, but then I went to work in Japan, where I had first-hand experience of working in a cultural heritage environment, working close up with artists in residences, and that's what really ignited me and made me passionate about coming back to the UK and working in the museum sector, specifically the public sector. And I had a number of jobs at different national institutions, as well as smaller art organisations in a variety of roles, whether that was working with exhibitions or collections management or in a learning capacity. But for the last decade, I've exclusively worked with digital artists and artworks. So my work right now as a curator is incredibly varied. A lot of what I do is finding artists for the collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I work with the digital art collection, and that entails both early pioneering works but also contemporary practices. So some of what I do is based around research, looking what people have done and historically how the sector has developed and how different people have worked over times in the medium, the media that they've used and why they've done it. So there's a lot of research. The other component is actually caring for objects, so whether that's working hand in hand with conservators to think about the best way to preserve works. Another dimension is exhibitions and displays. So I recently co-curated an exhibition called Chance and Control, 50 years of computer-generated work, which was on display at the V&A and then went on tour to Colchester and to Chester. So some of the challenges of working with new media and digital, and we can talk about definitions later. I think certainly preservation from a museum perspective is pretty high up there, because artists work in all sorts of ways and don't necessarily think about the longevity of their work. But as a curator who looks after a collection, which ensures that those works will be there in perpetuity, there are real questions about how do you best care for works when perhaps the technology will become obsolete, or just actually breaking down what actually makes the artwork, and learning the terminology, especially if it's maybe a field that I don't know about, or maybe isn't documented in the same way. I think these are some of the challenges that are particularly relevant to an institutional curator working with artists who may work in the digital realm. One of the challenges of working in this field is the changing definition. There are lots of different terms that people use to describe media art or digital art, and I think of new media as an umbrella term. So within that can encompass software art, internet art, generative practices, glitch art, similarly like digital art that just thinks about works that employ or use emerging and new technologies to create. I think it's important that artists should think about preserving their work at the beginning of the process, because it's very hard as a curator and a conservator to come along at the end of an object's lifespan and think about continuing it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to inform all the decisions that an artist makes, but just bearing in mind that if you think the object has longevity and you'd like to see it in a museum collection, that these will be some of the questions that will be asked of that object. So one of the things that I do when artworks enter a museum collection will be I'll sit down with the artist or a collection of artists and ask them about the work and how it's made, and sometimes that will involve lots of different methodologies. So if somebody's at the beginning of the process, they can maybe think about making notes or taking photographs, especially if it's a performative piece that only exists, it's ephemeral or intangible. But there are different ways of documenting works, especially if it's about the experience of something rather than like a physical object. I think it's really important that artists do think about, or at least make a note of like what they've done, why, and in the moment, because it become very easy to forget later on, especially if you do software updates or there's lots of different reasons why what you did at the beginning may change, and objects do change over time. And so I think keeping a note of that is really useful for researchers and curators. I don't think that artists necessarily have to do updates to their work by changing the media carrier, but they might need to be aware that that would be a conversation that they would have as a curator if it did enter an institution, and how would they feel about that. And if they're not happy for that to happen, then perhaps that artwork will be lost. So in terms of thinking about where I look for new artists and inspiration, I am really very proactive in going to different exhibitions. So I think it's really great when artists are able to put their work out there, whether that's in a solo show or a group exhibition, and in different scenarios. So sometimes it can be in somebody's living room, sometimes it can be in a big art gallery institution. I've seen a lot of work in very unusual different settings, whether that's a hospital, whether that's a law firm. So I spend a lot of my time going out to make studio visits, but also to go and see artists in different contexts. I spend a lot of my time also online researching different artists' works. Some of it's word of mouth, and others is a lot through talks and discussions and conferences. I also spend a lot of time looking at student degree shows and art prizes. There are a lot of different art prizes, so I'm interested to see both who's submitted work and who's been selected. So and also, first and foremost, I also spend a lot of time reading art journals and magazines and blogs and posts. And there's a lot of different avenues for artists to show their work, whether that's on Instagram or, I think there's, as I say, lots of different avenues. So I think increasingly it's really important for curators to kind of go that extra step and really seek out different artists' work. So I think it's really important as a curator who's very interested in research that artists make their work really accessible, and one way of doing that is by having an online presence, as I might come across an individual work in a show and it's the artwork that first and foremost grabs me, that I want to know more about. But I feel like if an artist has somewhere else that I can go to find out a bit more about their practice. I mean, first and foremost, contact details is a very basic thing, but it can be that I might want to have a conversation with an artist, or I might want to see where they've exhibited before or what other work they're making on, their current projects. So I think that it's important, and you can do it in different ways, but I definitely feel like it's important that artists document their work and then make that accessible to researchers, to audiences, to other artists and to curators, because it makes my life easier. So my advice for artists who are contemplating entering the Emerging Art Prize would be to really think about which works are being exhibited, and although it seems very basic, but when thinking about applications, think about why you're applying, editing works, and really answering all the questions on the application form, and perhaps thinking how the use of simple language to describe the work whilst elaborating on what it is really important as a judge, and also as a curator who sees a lot of work. Sometimes images aren't enough, they don't completely convey the nature of a work. So a well photographed piece or a very succinct description that accompanies a description and an image of the work really goes a long way. My advice to the wider artist community is that isolation really only works for a very select number of artists. That doesn't mean that you have to necessarily have a Facebook profile or an Instagram, but there needs to be some way that you communicate. I feel really strongly that artists need to reach out beyond their immediate circle and share their work, because a lot of what I do in a historical context is research certain artists' practice, and a lot of the time the work that I'm curating care for is maybe unsigned or has no supplementary documentation about it, and it's very difficult as an artist, and then inevitably some artists will get lost from art history. So I make a plea with artists at the beginning of their careers, or certainly who are emerging, to kind of think about the needs, it's very selfish, but of the curators of the future. If they feel really passionate about if the work should be shown in a particular way, or why they've made it, why they've used that particular medium, material, or inspired by something, that they should just make a note about that, because I think it's not necessary, they might forget it in the future, that information might get lost. So I think if it's crucial to your practice, then communicate that. I'm really looking forward to seeing from entrants who are entering the New Media Art Prize a whole variety of work. I'm really excited about being surprised, because the term is really broad, and so within that there can be a whole plethora of different kinds of practices. So it's actually, I'm most excited about finding somebody who's really pushing boundaries, just seeing lots of different kinds of work and the different inspirations behind the work, and also just the whole range of mixed media within them. I think it's absolutely crucial that curators from institutional background do seek out new artists, but I do want to make the plea that it's not solely a responsibility of curators. I think that these days, especially with social media, that lots and artists themselves can do an awful lot to do what once upon a time would have been seen the preserve of maybe a marketing team or I think these days people have to have many different hats, or at least be aware that it is possible to promote. So certainly I think that the role of the curator is to seek out artists, because without those artists, the curator becomes redundant. But that's not to say that it's solely their preserve. I think that time has gone and now it's about communication. It works two ways. So I envisage the art world embracing new media art as this is something that is something that continues to change. By its very definition, new only stays new for a while, and soon new media becomes old media. But I think it's here to stay, and it has been around for a while, but I think within that it will continue to change. So a lot of talk, a lot of what I'm contemplating at the moment is immersive media, but that's it, such as VR, AV, mixed reality, 360-degree video. But I think then maybe in future years that will obviously change, but the art market and the museum world and the art gallery world will change with it. I think that it's just definitely something that maybe curators in the past might have been a bit skeptical of or uncomfortable with, but I think increasingly emerging curators will take it for granted that what we think of as traditional isn't fixed. I think that the art world, specifically thinking about digital practices, needs more of critical discourse because it moves at such a pace. People are often keen to work with the latest technologies that there isn't always time to reflect on what's gone before. So when I often talk about the history of digital art in 50 years, I don't think artists are always aware of what's gone before them. And doesn't mean that has to inform what they do, but some sort of context is important to think about where individual works maybe sit or speak in relation to other works and other artist practices. And also for curators to think about the significance of individual works at particular times. And I think all of that just requires a little bit of taking a step back.